Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the Graying Jedi podcast. I am UrzaMaster. Joining me as always, Lord Uther and Jedi Master Psyllium Maas. Welcome back, gentlemen, to the council chambers as we once again embark into a galaxy far, far away. And this time, we're picking it back up with an old friend, Mando, in the Mandalorian Season 3. This episode, titled The Apostate, I turn it over to Jedi Master Psyllium Maas for a little bit of a background and a little bit of an in-depth review of this Season 3 opener.
Thank you, Jedi Master UrzaMaster. Thank you, Jedi Master Lord Uther. Welcome back, Graying Jedi fans. And I just felt a twinge as UrzaMaster introduced this episode. Yes. We are in Season 3, Chapter 17, and Rising. The Apostate is our kickoff to a brand new arc for our favorite Mandalorian and his still unnamed species, little pal, Grogu. The Apostate debuted on March 1st, 2023. It was the first time we've seen these characters since the final episode of the Book of Boba Fett. And that aired on February 9th, 2022. That was the In the Name of Honor. And that finished with the destruction of Mos Espa by a cranky Rancor that Din Djarin actually rode at one point. And then Grogu put down for Night Night in that episode. And a lot of unresolved plot threads from The Mandalorian Season 2 were actually all neatly sewn up in the Book of Boba Fett. So for Star Wars fans who decided to take a pass on that miniseries or just never made it through all of them, they may have been surprised to learn that the Mandalorian and his charge had been reunited and were now tooling around the galaxy, not in the Razor Crest, which was obliterated by Moff Gideon, but a souped-up N1 Naboo starfighter, courtesy of the prequel trilogy. And I must say that as cool as it is to see this high-flying machine that can zip around the galaxy in the blink of an eye, it doesn't appear to have much in the way of creature comforts. The Razor Crest, after all, they had an evac, when you had to use the restroom, and they had a weapons room, and they had bunks, and they had ladders. And this one just has it's a two-seater. So I don't know if they have to make more frequent stops for the various needs or not. So they've traded creature comforts for speed, but it's still a nifty-looking starship until we get maybe a revised Razor Crest down the line. I know that Jedi Master Lord Uther, that's one of his prize collections in the fleet. The Apostate was directed by Rick Famuyiwa, and it was written by series creator, showrunner Jon Favreau. Rick Famuyiwa, he's worked on The Mandalorian before. He actually got to do the second episode of Season 1, Chapter 2, The Child, which we covered, you'll see in our archives for the Graying Jedi. We covered that all the way back in Graying Jedi number 19. Famuyiwa also did on that first season, Chapter 6, The Prisoner, which introduced us to Bill Burr and that nasty crew of reprobates trying to free a prisoner on a New Republic ship. Had some horror elements to it that were quite well done. And we covered that on Warp Core 21. And then in the second season, he only got one of the 8 episodes to direct. But it was also a Bill Burr episode, Chapter 15, The Believer. And it's the one where Din Djarin was forced to remove his helmet in order to gain the information for Grogu's location on Moff Gideon's cruiser. And we covered that on Warp Core 29. So he's got Mandalorian experience. He's got Bill Burr experience, although Bill Burr does not make an appearance in The Apostate. And this season, Famuyiwa is really engaged. He actually is going to direct almost a third of Season 3. He's got 3 episodes this season alone. He is a director and a writer. He was able to co-write The Prisoner and The Believer in seasons past. This one, he was just a director for hire with Favreau sitting at the keyboard. But he's a USC grad. He graduated after yours truly matriculated from the halls of Tommy Trojan. He's a good egg, and he brings a much needed. He can do drama, comedy, and action. Season 3 brings us back Pedro Pascal, but it also gives credit to his 2 on-camera stunt doubles, who now are credited in the episodes each week, Brendan Wayne and Lateef Crowder. By this point in the series, Pedro Pascal, 85 to 90% of his work will be on the voiceover. And in fact, this season, you never saw Din Djarin's face, unlike the previous seasons. So it is widely rumored, although never 100% confirmed by Lucasfilm, that Pedro Pascal did not spend very much time on Mandalorian sets, and that it was the work of his stunt doubles, Brendan Wayne and Lateef Crowder, who do an excellent job, especially when you think they have to convey all of that information, acting, character, just through basically body movement and head posturing and so on and so forth. So Pedro's still with us, and he still delivers a killer reading of Din Djarin's dialogue, but I don't believe he spent too much time. He was busy working on The Last of Us and so forth. And since then, he's only gotten busier. There's a second season of the hit HBO series coming out. He's one of the 3 main leads in Gladiator 2 from Ridley Scott coming out in November. He's got a big screen Mandalorian and Grogu picture getting ready to go before the cameras early next year. So, and he's got a Corona commercial that you've seen where he discovers that sitting on the beach is very preferable with a nice cerveza. So don't mourn Pedro Pascal. He's busy and he's earning it. This season, we also have the return of Katie Sackhoff as Bo-Katan Kryze, Emily Swallow as the Armorer. The late Carl Weathers will return as Greef Karga. We have Katie M. O'Brien returning as the sinister Imperial remnant who served with Moff Gideon. We have Paul Sun Young Lee as Carson Teva. We have Giancarlo Esposito as Moff Gideon, and Amy Sedaris as her Tatooine junk dealer, Pelimoto, and her crazy pit droids. So a lot of familiar faces, and there'll be some new ones as we go through on the season. We won't be seeing too much more of Cara Dune. Her absence is referenced in this episode by Greef Karga, and there was some fallout that we've touched on before in between seasons that resulted in her no longer being a welcome guest on the sets. Who knows where or when that may change, but for now she is off fighting with special forces and hopefully doing a good job of that. We also had a cameo from Jimmy Kimmel's nephew, Wesley Kimmel. He played the young foundling who earns his mask in the opening scenes of this chapter. A couple of behind-the-scenes notes. Dean Cundy, John Carpenter's cinematographer and the man who also shot Jurassic Park for Steven Spielberg. He was our cinematographer for this episode. Did a fantastic job. And Ludwig Göransson, who created the distinctive Western themes for The Mandalorian and Black Panther for Marvel. He is no longer doing the episode-to-episode scoring. His themes, obviously, he gets credit for, but Joseph Shirley has replaced him as the composer who does the actual music, stitching between scenes. So we have a new composer, but he's using a lot of Ludwig's original compositions going forward. And Joseph will throw in a few himself. So, gentlemen, because some of this info was covered in Book of Boba Fett, and because in television you can never assume that everyone's watched everything, this episode kind of starts off on a treadmill. And I don't mean that in a negative way, but you have to reintroduce the audience to information that has already been covered, just they may have missed it. So that's why we have a conversation between the armorer and Din Djarin about the fact that he's removed his mask. He's now been cast out from the Mandalorian clan, and how he can redeem himself, which will, of course, be a major story point this season. So we had to sort of, almost like a soap opera, sort of recap where we were so that we could move forward. And we also had to have sort of a similar restating of the dynamic between Din Djarin and Bo-Katan, because at the end of season 2, Din Djarin had the Darksaber, and Bo-Katan had lost her claim to the throne of Mandalore by his having it, and the only way that she could get it back would be to defeat him and presumably kill him in one-on-one combat. And so we had to sort of restate. So this episode, in some degrees, is just kind of a, here's where we are, and here's all the threads we're going to be chasing down this third season. When you consider the second season premiere, Chapter 9, The Marshal, this one didn't quite have the same scope. We had a big action scene early between the Mandalorian clan on a new planet, not Navarro, and this giant sea turtle. And the effects by ILM were outstanding, even for the small screen on that fight. This was like the fourth time I've seen this episode, and I thought, wow, that really looks good. They really did a nice job of giving us an action beat to set the season off and running. And then it's basically a bunch of meetings that Din Djarin takes on Navarro and on the Bo-Katan. I got a very Game of Thrones vibe from Bo-Katan. She's in this wonderful sort of coastal castle with big yawning hallways and corridors and so forth. And she's just kind of sitting on a throne, just sulking. And I'm just like, well, I mean, is that how is like, what's her day look like? Right. I mean, is it just like, it's 2:00, I'm going to go and brood. But I got a very Daenerys Targaryen Dragonstone, for those of you who have watched HBO's show. I got a very Game of Thrones vibe there in that whole sequence. We had a crazy callback again to the Terminator when they try to revive IG-11 and it reverts back to its original programming and then starts crawling on the ground like a crazy T-800. So that was fun. Again, it was poignant now because obviously at the time of its airing, Carl Weathers was very much a vital and part of the show. But now, knowing that he is no longer with us and has joined the Force, it was a little more poignant to see Greef as the High Magistrate. We introduced the idea of pirates. Space pirates that will also play in throughout the season, and a nice tense standoff in the town square. I love Din Djarin's, is there a problem here, Magistrate? Just sort of itching to draw the blaster. So those were all very good. And I know that Jedi Master Lord Uther was excited to see some sequel trilogy characters or race pop back in, the Anzellans, who are master droid mechanics, and they're just cute as a button, working on IG-11. They're all voiced by Shirley Henderson, whom you probably would know if you've seen any Harry Potters. She was the spirit of Moaning Myrtle, and she's generally got a very squeaky, kind of strange voice. And that's normal. And she's doing the high-pitched Anzellan's bad baby because Grogu, if nothing else, he loves a hug, and he does get to a little huggy with them at one point during the episode there. And then we had a callback to The Empire Strikes Back with the asteroid belt chase from Din Djarin and the pirates, and so on and so forth. So when you compare it to Chapter 9, it feels smaller, and I think that's deliberate. It doesn't have the Kryat dragon. It doesn't have the Tusken Raiders being forced to team up with the humans, settlers. I think they went big. It doesn't have the Gamorrean guards in a cage match, with John Leguizamo turning the tables on Din Djarin. So this episode, in some degrees, felt smaller, and it felt, as Jedi Master UrzaMaster likes to say, like sort of a bridge episode. It really is just trying to say, this is the direction we plan to go, and you're going to have to wait an episode or two for the really big things to happen, and they do. Spoiler alert. But this one in and of itself was more about really just kind of putting the tablecloth off and making sure that the silverware was on the right side of the plate and so forth. Again, from a Star Wars fan here, there's no complaints on that score, but it did feel like they had turned it down maybe to a 6 or a 7 instead of saying, let's hit them with 11 right out of the gate. I'm interested, gentlemen, in how you read it, how you saw it. There was even a nod to Purgil, I should mention. Graying Jedi fans remember this aired before Ahsoka, in terms of the actual, when we watch these things. So this was a little tease to the upcoming Ahsoka series, that we would get the space whales through hyperspace, which again, eerie, ominous, but also beautiful. So what do you think, guys? How did we do with the apostate?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely a vehicle, for sure, but it has all the makings of, I think, like a great Clint Eastwood first act. I think of the spaghetti westerns where you set up all the characters, you put all the pieces on the table, you have some excitement, a shootout kind of situation. You get introduced to these pirates, you get a lot of the threads that are going to make this season what it is. And it's filled with nostalgia, and it's filled with just world building in a way that it I mean, you got to remember there's a pretty good break between season 2, season 3. So, for my end, I was just impressed by the fact that it sucked me right back into Star Wars. I know I'm watching a Western, but I also feel very much immersed in Star Wars. And it really does set everyone up nicely. So it makes sense, because I actually had not watched Book of Boba Fett the first time I saw season 3. So it filled me in adequately. I mean, granted, now that I've seen Boba all the way through, I'm like, I was missing some details, but I was very happy with what I saw. It wasn't anything terribly outstanding. Like, I wouldn't say that this episode blew my mind. I do
No.
think the, episode in season 2 was better, but I don't think I would discount this one for being of a smaller scope. I think this was definitely largely needed to kick off season 3, because you really did have to kind of reinvent all of the storylines you were going to tell, because season 2 wrapped up pretty tightly. I mean, there was nothing really to cover, too much so anyway, that didn't really get resolved in Book of Boba Fett either. So I enjoyed what I saw. I really was hoping to get a little bit more, Kate Sackhoff in this episode. But that's just me, like, because I always want more.
Yeah.
But I do think the way they painted her as sort of this like dejected queen of the Mandalore, but kind of opened her up as, I think they could have easily steered her towards a villain, somehow, and made her an antagonist in this season. And they took a different route. That for me was really cool, because I was really thinking that's where they were going to take this in this episode. And of course, that would have been compelling. But I point to the writing in this show being unpredictable, in a good way. You're not getting steered into a wall. You're going further out into the galaxy, and that's where I feel like the vehicle episodes that sometimes aren't as successful but are still serviceable, this is a cut above those because it not only brought me back, but it immersed me and it made me guess at what was coming next. And I didn't have any of the right answers.
First off, to one of our greatest fans out there, the commish, we hope that he continues to heal and get well. And in the words of Andrew Dice Clay, what is this, a setup? So it is. This whole episode is a setup for season 3, and and a reminder as well. I did like the Terminator reference with the IG crawling around the ground. I thought that was great. And there was some discussion at some point of going to the outer rim. What do you remember that at any point there, Psyllium Maas? Weren't they talking about the outer rim at some point?
Well, I
Or
mean,
is that where Navarro?
I think Navarro. I mean, because there's wild space, which is where Exegol and Palpatine, somehow he's returned, was doing all his stuff, and then you have your outer rim, and then you have your core worlds, your Coruscants, and so forth. I think Navarro in the whole Atlas is kind of, it's not quite on the frontier, but it's certainly a ways away from the center of the galaxy, the important systems, if you will. So I mean, are they technically out there? I mean, it's close.
The only reason why I bring that up is I would like to see some stories that deal with the outer rim, because we've heard of it at different points and it seems like kind of an unknown. So when that was brought up, whether it's not going to be this show, but even if something in the future, they can kind of explore that a little bit more. That's something I would definitely like to see. So I thought that was interesting that was brought up. So I think the leader of the pirates reminds me of Pizza the Hut. Like, he looks like him and even talks like him in a sense. So that was kind of cracking me up when I was seeing him on screen, wanting them to go after Mando. It is a solid episode, right? And it's going to set up what's going to happen in season 3. And spoiler alert, to me at least, the writing in season 3 seems to be unpredictable in the sense of we're going to have some great episodes and we're going to have some that are going to struggle a little bit. That is something that's kind of coming up. And I always wonder, how does that happen, or why does that happen? It just seems like with Mandalorian, the first 2 seasons, just they had almost every piece of it. Just every episode hits, right? And I know it's season 3, which I guess is a little bit of a preview of season 3. It seems to kind of have its ups and downs. And we're seeing that with Star Trek on our other podcast, The Warp Core. Season 3, the original series, is going to experience some of that as well. So I don't know if that becomes tired writing or they run out of ideas. But I would, and we've kind of had this discussion too. I'm all over the place right now, but too bad. We've just kind of talked about what causes it to fall off. Is it bored writing? Is it not having a vision? Is it people upstairs telling the writers what they want? Like, at what point does that happen? So I'm just kind of curious as to how you see, well, again, I guess this is more of a preview of what's going to happen in season 3 with its strengths and things like that. But what causes that to kind of happen? What do you guys think? Is it boredom? Is it, I'm going to get really creative, or trying to outthink your audience? Because I think that happens sometimes. Like, I'm going to throw all these curveballs and I'm asking a bunch of questions and not letting you guys talk. So go ahead.
Yeah, no, I'd love to hear Psyllium Maas's thoughts, but I kind of agree. I think that it's a mixture of the bigwigs stepping where they shouldn't step, and I do think sometimes it's not having a clear plan. Obviously, there's always and we've talked about this in episodes past here on Pending Rebrand. But I do think that when writing falls off, it's a mixture of they're being told what to interject for one reason or another, or a combination with they don't have a clear vision for what an episode's supposed to do. So they tend to go off on a tangent or derail for a moment. Sometimes it has to involve the Easter Bunny. as we see on another podcast of ours, which you all should go into the archives and check out that episode because we're all scratching our heads. I do think, like, with these direct to streaming shows, there tends to be quite a bit less of that just because it is so tight. You have that economy of screen time and words, and you don't get 50 episodes to fluff out. You have 8, 10, 12, maybe a little better than that. And that, I think, behooves solid writing for the most part. It's not universal, of course, but I think we're a little lucky in the fact that there isn't a huge span that they feel they have to cover. We're not going to get a Wesley Crusher episode. You know what I mean? We're going to get more core involved. At least the sort of tertiary episodes play into a greater theme, and it feels a little better. I mean, I'll be honest, the Power Rangers episode of Boba Fett almost lost me, but they did tie it back together later, and it worked out.
So the obvious answer to your query in terms of show, and especially shows that are long running, you can go back to all of your favorite network shows over time, NYPD Blue, ER, Law and Order, et cetera, et cetera. Oftentimes they will replace showrunners or voices in the writer's room. And so you just get a different perspective. Aaron Sorkin's The West Wing was, for better or worse, had a singular vision when he was running the show and writing every episode and so on and so forth. Well, he left at the end of the 5th season. He, burned himself out, and he abruptly left the show he created. And they brought in veteran showrunner John Wells, who had worked on ER and some other classic shows of that era. And John Wells's vision for The West Wing was very different than Aaron Sorkin's, as you can imagine. So suddenly a show in its later years has a different voice. The characters sound slightly different. And if you're a big Aaron Sorkin fan, you hate it. And if you're a John Wells fan, you say, that's more like it. So that's the biggest thing. Now, they haven't made any of those creative changes on The Mandalorian. Jon Favreau is still the Grand Poobah. Dave Filoni is still right there marching with him. So I think, without spoiling what is to come, I can already see where Lord Uther, Jedi Master Lord Uther, is going here. There were at least 2 episodes this season that engendered a lot of online chatter and possible controversy. One of them, which we'll be exploring in the not too distant future, I think is an extraordinary hour of television, and I will push back hard on any critiques of that one. The second one, which occurs a little bit later in the season, I think falls prey to too many guest stars in the kitchen. And I think that entire episode, coupled with who was directing it at the time and so forth, I think it made for an experience that slightly comes under. For those of you that have been following my Star Wars grades, you're going to definitely want to see what color I pick for that episode, that chapter later in the season. But I think the biggest thing that was confronting them here is they had sort of a twofold creative thing. One, there was going to be a Cara Dune spinoff, right, from the New Republic. But any storylines that she would have been involved in this season, I mean, even in this first visit back to Navarro, that all had to be scrapped, and scrapped at the 11th hour. So there's a certain sense of, yes, we have to tear up the scripts, or at least those pages, and fill in the blanks. But the other thing is, and this is where you see the hand of Dave Filoni, the big storyline here of his redemption on Mandalore and Bo-Katan's quest to unite her people and recover the Darksaber, all of that comes from Filoni's Clone Wars animated series, much like the first season of Ahsoka is an extension of his animated Rebels series. This one obviously came first. But this is taking ideas that had only been explored in an animated context and fleshing them out literally. And so you have to bring along, we were talking about bringing people along from season 2 to Book of Boba Fett to here. You also have to set the table again on, things that we learned about Mandalore and Death Watch and Bo-Katan and her sister, and all of these things that, people like me have sat there and consumed already. It's entertainment we've consumed. And so we have to do it for the people that have not watched 8 seasons of Clone Wars or 5 seasons of Rebels or so on and so forth. So I think part of what you're seeing here is not that they didn't have a vision, that they didn't have a plan. It's just that they chose a storyline and an arc to tell that required more finessing. And so they weren't, it wasn't always we stuck the landing. We might have had a little bobble on the landing as we hit the vault, to coin an Olympics turn of phrase. But again, big swings, as Jedi Master UrzaMaster says. I mean, they're not sitting on their laurels. They're not just rehashing plot points we've seen from the first 2 seasons. They're trying to go bigger, bolder, braver, I think. And sometimes with big swings, you hit a solid single, you hit one up the middle for a ground rule double, or you might take it to the seats. So, and circle the bases. So I feel like I agree with you that this is the first season where it didn't feel like everything was an automatic home run. And I will give part of that, like I say, to the necessity of having to kind of revamp some of what they may have been planning due to behind the scenes stuff, and also trying to take a storyline that was not as familiar to the casual or even the specific Star Wars fans, and say, hey, we're going to tell this whole Mandalorian history and so forth. Now, we've done some of it already, but here's bring you up to speed, and then we're going to take it a couple of steps further. So, and like UrzaMaster suggested, a lot of threads were wrapped up in season 2. Season 2, I mean, you would have felt disappointed if Grogu goes off with Luke Skywalker and you're like, that's it. But in the same breath, much of what they had been building towards, they'd captured Moff Gideon, they'd rescued Grogu, they'd, and so on and so forth. A lot of those things had been kind of, you could have walked away if you absolutely had to. So here you're starting the engine up again, saying, all right, what are we going to do now? I know. Let's go and do the Mandalorian arc, the actual Mandalorian arc, and see where that takes us. So that's my reading on it.
Right. One more quick question, because UrzaMaster, you have a literature background, all that experience with it, and I'm going somewhere with this question and that comment. But anyway, and then Jedi Master Psyllium Maas, obviously, you're a USC film graduate, and you write some absolutely incredible stuff that I've read over the years. And here's why I'm asking this question to kind of line it up with my previous question in a sense. So as a writer, whether it's solo, so I'm asking you this, UrzaMaster, from a literature perspective of someone writing a book, right? And then Jedi Master Psyllium Maas, I'm going to ask you from a filmatic, that's maybe the wrong word, but whatever, a cinema or a television viewpoint. And here's why I admire writers so much, because I get ideas too. I think everyone has ideas, right? This starts, this happens, this is the end. But it's very, very concise, right? And I've told Jedi Master Psyllium Maas, I can get to A to Z with an idea, but I can't do B, C, D. I can't fill it in to get there, right? All the pieces that need to be put in place to tell a story. I can get the idea. So when someone sits down to write a book, or if someone sits down to write a television series, and I'd have to think in this sense right now with Disney, it's even tougher, because when you're writing the television series, it not only has to line up with whatever history you're creating right there, but it might be branching off to go backwards and reference a previous movie, or set up something that we're going to see in the future, like we keep thinking is going to happen with Ahsoka. So if you're writing solo, do you do that? Do you sit down as an author and you're like, here's the arc, and I'm going to fill in all the pieces here? And in a screenwriter's room, is it multiple people sitting down with a whiteboard? Like, this is what I envision, right? Like, you got a whiteboard and you're going, Mando's going to find Grogu, and then we got to get him back to I'm just making something up. You got to get him back to Mandalore so Grogu can be the leader of the Mandalorians, which I still think is going to happen, right? Now you got to fill all that in and trying to make that. Is that how it works? I don't know. So let me start with UrzaMaster, and I'll go to Psyllium Maas, just because
Yeah.
I know you've got more. So Urza, what do you like? What are your thoughts on that?
I think everybody's got their own process. I think there's a big debate among folks who study writing, literature, and folks who actually do this for a living, and or well, it's a hard question to answer because I think everybody's got an opinion.
Okay.
I know and I think it gets rather chippy because I think there are some writers who had a distinct gift for going from A to Z in almost a one shot stream of consciousness Virginia Woolf kind of method, um, with minimal to no input or editing, and sometimes that comes out beautifully, and sometimes it's completely incomprehensible. I think, from a literature standpoint, I think there's a lot of revision, a lot of contemplation, study that plays into some of the absolutely most fantastic stuff that comes out. I think in a writer's room, you have multiple hands in the pot, and you're really just fielding those ideas to connect dots in between. And some of that gets line item rewrites along the way, but the big picture is really what you're storyboarding. The rest of it is details. I think about Curb Your Enthusiasm, right? They have an outline, and then you fill it in with the camera on. That, in some contexts, plays out absolutely wonderfully. Not so much when you're trying to make a Star Wars. When you're dealing with existing canon, for sure, there's a lot more study and careful editing and revision and ideas getting tossed around, and then, okay, well, how does this connect to that? It's so much more complicated than writing an episode of Curb or Seinfeld or Cheers or something, where you don't really need to connect anything to anything. If it can stand on its own, that's how you get those shows with Monster of the Week episodes. They loosely tie into canon generally, like X-Files, Supernatural. They don't have to be, you could just be hunting a werewolf. There's no reason for it to play into the greater season storyline other than a line or two here which might connect to some nefarious character or a scene. So you can have a lot of hands in the pot and be very successful. Likewise, you can completely steer things into a concrete wall. I mean, you can really mess things up on a big scale, but it's isolated, right? Psyllium Maas, I'm sure you have much clearer insight on this, but I am curious. Like, is this a storyboarding session that goes on behind the scenes, or what's the detail?
These are great questions, Lord Uther and Jedi Master UrzaMaster. And I think when you look at other shows in the streaming firmament of Star Wars, Andor, or just the most recently completed Acolyte, I think they very much used what Jedi Master Lord Uther suggests. It's a whiteboard. It's 6 guys and gals in a room, and they're just throwing ideas out. Okay, what are we going to do? Oh, May and Osha are going to switch sides, and May is going to become the good one, and Osha is going to become the bad one. Like, those are things that you shout out. You write it down exhaustively. Then you just start carving it up. Okay, we're doing 8 episodes, 6 episodes, whatever. Episode 1's going to end here. Episode 2 here. Episode 3 is going to be a flashback. Episode 4. So you literally just break it down and break it out per se. That is how probably now, at least 75% of the shows you're enjoying on television with multiple writers or different writers each week are handling their business. I think the only way it can get a little strange or no is when you have like an Aaron Sorkin for the West Wing, for example, or Jon Favreau for the Mandalorian and Book of Boba Fett, where he himself is writing 75, 80, 90% of these scripts. So I'm sure he has sounding boards. I'm sure he and Filoni have their own whiteboard, but I don't know that he's in a room with a bunch of other writers and story editors and so forth necessarily. Maybe just from an inspiration standpoint, but I think when it's coming from sort of a singular voice, I think there's probably more of, like UrzaMaster suggests, more of that stream of consciousness solo vision quest that one would go on and so forth. And again, just because Jon Favreau is the one who's actually credited with it, I mean, those are all Writers Guild rules. That's not to say that somebody else didn't have a hand in, punching it up, or, I think the Writers Guild rule is, I think you have to have written at least 60% of a script to have your name on it. I think that's the magic equation, 50 plus 10 or something like there. So if there were multiple writers, like in The Acolyte, then, those people, someone did a draft, then someone else rewrote that draft and rewrote at least 60% of it. And then that's how you kind of come with multiple writers. But I think in the case of Favreau, like I say, there's a lot of episodes where it's just him as writer. So he may have very well just been sitting late one night, vaping and just pounding this stuff off on the keyboards there. Like I say, I think everyone wants a show. You don't want to just see what you just saw. And, we've never been in this position with Star Wars where it was like, hey, you have to top yourself each and every season and practically each and every episode, because you don't want people to watch an episode and go, oh man, last week's was so much better. This stinks. So Star Trek has decades of television's do's and don'ts and so forth. And, Star Wars is still kind of the relatively new kid on the block when it comes to this type of storytelling. So there may be a couple of cul-de-sacs and dead ends and stub toes along the way. But overall, I think as long as you can maintain a consistent vision and give us what we believe Star Wars is supposed to be in terms of its promises and mythology and so forth, then yeah, even the stumbles sometimes you can learn from.
Well, gentlemen, I think that brings us to our ever popular lightsaber kyber crystal ratings. And this episode being the first of the season, as we typically do, we expect a bit of a vehicle. So we'll start off with Lord Uther. What did you feel this episode earned for you?
I will go green, and I'll use a marker for that because we were just talking about the writing and what it takes, to get there. Even though I know what's going to, I'm trying to approach this like, hey, I'm just kind of seeing it for the first time. I know what's going to happen down the road. It is a vehicle to kind of set up what we're going to wind up seeing. So a solid episode for me. The action and like Jedi Master Psyllium Maas said, the special effects were just lights out for this one. So that's what elevated it up to a green for me. So I'll hand it off to UrzaMaster next.
Yeah, I am going to go with blank CD Tower Green. I agree. It was visually a fantastic ride. I was very immersed in Star Wars again. I felt really good about what I was seeing and what direction it was heading in, and it felt unpredictable, which I think is tough to do in television. And I will always say that, kind of for better or worse, I always appreciate it. So it was great for me.
Great Jedi fans, take heart. I have not lost faith in the show one iota, and I feel that it is representative of the very best that Star Wars streaming has to offer. But again, I too know what comes in the not too distant future in a galaxy far, far away. And this episode, when compared to the actual Chapter 1, the Mandalorian, or Chapter 9, the Marshal, as I said, it did bring the temperature down and so forth. So we're going to go, it's kind of hard to see with the glare affairs. This is a blue Post-it note here. So we're not going to start at green for season 3. That again is not to say that I felt it was of a diminished quality or effort. But I know there are a couple of greens this season, and I want them to stand apart. I think from an episode that is nuts and bolts Star Wars, not transcendent Force Awakenings just yet, but stick with it, friends, because like I say, there's a really good one coming up here pretty soon. So,
Absolutely. Well, Jedi Council, we break again off into the galaxy far, far away. Until next time, may the Force be with you.
especially you two.